that the temperature will continue to cooperate and be above freezing. I think that's the key today. But we have a frigid week before us, don't we? No matter what today holds. Anyone else needing an outline? Just keep your hand raised and we'll get it to you. I appreciate being asked to teach the class, and I'll be your teacher for this quarter. And the parables will be the study that we do. And as this is the first Sunday of the new year, I'd like to mention something I saw from a fellow preacher who said, as you are starting this new year, stay with your P's. P is in Paul, but with prayer, priorities, peace, positivity, and patience. I think taking these into heart can help us certainly in the new year. Prayer, priorities, peace, positivity, and patience. But the parables of Jesus is our study, and I draw material from a number of sources, and I've listed them at the front end of this. Herman Horn wrote a very definitive work on the parables. Neil Lightfoot from Oklahoma Christian wrote a book on the parables. As a young teenager, my Sunday school teacher gave me a copy of that book, and it planted a seed for me in wanting to study and learn more about the parables. And Wayne Jackson, who passed away just a few years back, has also written a good bit on the parables. I enjoy art. I have done a little bit of painting, and Norman Rockwell was always a favorite of mine. When I lived in Chattanooga, I thrilled at the prospect one day of actually getting to go to a museum and see the Rockwell paintings that were on loan. I think Norman Rockwell was an underappreciated artist. He was Americana to me, and he used to say that his paintings tell a story. In fact, all paintings tell a story when you get right down to it. Well, Jesus told a story in a parable form, and that's certainly the case of a study of his parables. And he spake to them many things in parables. Matthew 13 and verse 3. You may recall the story of the little Sunday school child that was very busy with her crayon. And the teacher said, "What are you drawing?" And the child said, "I'm drawing God." The teacher said, "Well, don't you know nobody knows what God looks like?" And the little child said, "Well, they will when I finish my picture." Well, the parables are a picture of God. God is presenting information through Jesus, his Son, and Jesus is telling us about God, about God's revelation, what is man's response to that revelation, And we can know all the revelation, but if we don't apply it to our lives, it's not doing any good for us. We've got to have application, don't we? There is the scheme of redemption, the plan of salvation given to us in Scripture, and we're so thankful for that. Let's just give some background relative to Jesus. He grew up in a small town, and it was Jesus of Nazareth, even though he was born in Bethlehem. He learned a trade. He worked with his hands, carpentry. His Mary's husband was Joseph, and he was a carpenter. And in that carpentry shop in Nazareth, I feel sure Jesus took a number of things into his heart and into his mind, as he did with other experiences in Nazareth. You think about the fact that the associates of Jesus, for the most part, were people who were close to the land and close to the sea, and Jesus was a sharp observer. And he used language, the things they were acquainted with. That's often called common ground. I like to, in any Bible study, to find out what do I have in common with this person in their religious beliefs. And you can move on from common ground to teach new lessons. But to know first off, well, what's common ground? Our religious neighbors, for example, profess faith in Jesus. That declaration is common ground. Now, what does Jesus require of us? That's moving it into the next level, to the next step. But as Jesus used common ground, things that everybody was acquainted with, he drew in the audience. The whole world loves a story, it's been said. And Jesus was the master teacher, and he was also a master storyteller. And we appreciate that in him so much. He talked about seemingly ordinary events and objects, and they're not much different from place to place. They're somewhat timeless from generation to generation. He talked about farmers, landowners, bread, salt, flowers, birds, rain. And he gave us his way of life in vivid word pictures. The parables make up more than a third of the recorded teachings of Christ. And often he put men to thinking by using these pictures of truth. Now, he didn't leave truth in the abstract, but he brought it down within the reach of the people, and the parables are a concrete form of truth. For example, Jesus did not say, "Beware of ostentation in your religion." You never heard Jesus say that. But he did say, "Don't blow a trumpet when you do your giving." Well, that's ostentation, isn't it? Someone thinks they can toot their own horn when they do their giving. All the world loves a story, and it's certainly the case that the world remembers the parables of Jesus. So, let's look at and understand some matters relative to the Word itself. When I was a freshman at Freed-Hardeman, one of the first things most Bible majors took was Greek. I didn't do so well in Latin in high school, but I liked Greek, and it was something I could put a handle on. The word parable is the Greek word parabole. So all of you that have come, you've learned a Greek word today, parabole. And it's a compound word. Para means alongside of, and balo means to throw. Uh, Balo was one of my favorite words because I could do word association with it. Throw the ball. Balo means to throw. And that's all that. Word association can help us with our memory, can't it? But it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And the throwing alongside of, Jesus takes a common, ordinary thing that people are acquainted with, and he throws it alongside of a truth that he wants to explain further. He wants to compare further, to make a lesson. It's a picture of truth. The word parabole occurs 50 times in the New Testament, and 48 of those times it's found in the 4 gospel accounts. It is a comparison, an analogy, an illustration, a figure, a maxim, a simile. And there is power and impact in the parables themselves. Let me just note, for example, that as the master teacher, Jesus teaches from the ordinary to the extraordinary, from the familiar to the unfamiliar, to the known, from the known to the unknown, from the everyday to the eternal, from the physical to the spiritual. And again, I really like the definition that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Well, that's a good definition, but it's really not broad enough. In Luke 4:23, physician, heal thyself is said to be a parable. And so a short comparison can even be a parable. Or the things that proceed out of a man defile a man. Mark 7, verses 15 through 17. That's a proverb or a riddle, but it's also said to be a parable. So, parable in Scripture is a broad term that it includes short sayings and short stories. It is a figurative expression or a story. Well, let's look at the number or classification of parables. Horn is the one who counted them and said there's 61. We only have 13 weeks in this quarter. So we're not going to be looking at all 61, but there are 61 in all, and there are those in story form include 30 to 35. There's some difficulty classifying them. There are parables about things, plants, animals, and humans. And the difficulty is, what is the main thing that gets across the idea of the parable? Is it the dragnet or the fish? Is it the sower or the seed or the soils? The question is, what got across the central idea? Matthew and Luke contain the most parables. And if you're talking about majority between the two, Luke has the most parables. The majority of those parables are exceptional in beauty and appeal that Luke has. I might also add that Mark has a fourth of the spoken words of Jesus are parables. Luke has a half of Christ's spoken words or parables. And Luke has 31 parables in all. John doesn't use the word parabole, parable, but he uses the word parmoia, which is figure or proverb, when John is accounting parables. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have 7 parables in common, parallel accounts. Matthew and Luke have 5 in common, and there are several that they're recorded in only one gospel account. Matthew records 12, Mark records 2, and Luke records 19. Okay, let's look at Jesus' use of the parable. Other New Testament writers use an allegory and do not use the parable story. Now, the parable is not something that Jesus originated. It's found in the Old Testament. Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7. Israel was described as a vineyard that God planted, and it was yielding wild grapes. And so the point was being made from that parable by Isaiah. 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 7. You remember Nathan the prophet told a parable about a ewe lamb, that a man stole it and prepared it for his dinner, for his guests, even though he had huge flocks and herds. And David said, that man needs to be punished severely. Words to that effect. And we remembered Nathan the prophet turned to David and said, well, David, you're the man. You're who I was describing. There's also the use of the parable in 2 Samuel 14 and also in Ezekiel chapter 20. So we know Jesus knew the Old Testament, and Jesus knew the book of nature, and he knew the book of life. Jesus therefore found and adopted and adapted and perfected the parable. For example, the story of the prodigal son, that parable, is regarded by many as the world's greatest short story. And we'll say a little bit more about that even today. Christ used parables, I think, to get attention. Any public speaker knows that he wants to capture the attention of the audience. And to say something like, let me tell you a parable, let me tell you a story, well, people kind of perk up the ear, would like to hear it. And I mean, even from little children, tell me a bedtime story. We love stories. We love parables. So he is arousing the curiosity of an audience at the beginning of a story, and then we watch Jesus as he leads them to follow him all the way through the story without realizing where he was leading them. And then the hidden meaning of the parable would strike them like a flash, and they couldn't contradict his message. So what's he doing there? He's leading men to accept a truth before they recognize that it applied to them personally. The story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite, that was very pointed against them and their prejudicial mind against a Samaritan. But they didn't realize it until on into the story. Just as David did not realize Nathan the prophet was talking about him when he told the parable of the man with the little ewe lamb. So, why would Jesus use parables? I'd like to suggest a number of reasons. One of them was to conceal truth from the unreceptive. There was any number of people that were not receptive to the teachings of Jesus at all. And Jesus could move along and teach those who were receptive. But the unreceptive, I'm going to speak in parables. He also would reveal truth to the receptive. Let him that has ears to hear, let him hear. Matthew 13. Jesus himself talked about not casting your pearls before swine. He would put teaching out. The receptive understood, but the unreceptive may have turned a deaf ear. And then there was also the self-protection of his teaching until his time should come. If, to coin an expression, Jesus had laid all his cards on the table and said everything that he was trying to do and transpiring in his 3 years of ministry, it's possible they would have tried to have taken him and crucified him sooner than his time was. But he knew when his time was. He was moving toward that time, but he wasn't going to have his life taken from him. And that's evident by Jesus saying, no one has power over my life. I will lay it down. That says Jesus and God were in control of the timeline, start to finish. And one of the ways they were in control of the timeline was they concealed some things couched in parables. And so I think that's very helpful to know. Now, the beauty of the parable is economy of words, appeal to imagination. As he describes animals or plants or farming, you picture it in your mind's eye. It's simple, yet profound. And the parts work together in harmony, proportion, grace, unity. They're appropriate and adapted. And Jesus showed the supremacy of the spiritual by the parable. In the parable, in the region of thought, expressed the divine mind. Another great study we could do about the miracles of Jesus is that by miracles, in the region of action, Jesus showed divine power. Now, something before we even start, some ground rules for parables. First off, find out the central truth the parable sets forth. I can't stress this enough. Find out the central truth. What's the main lesson? All related truths are to be evaluated within that framework. And we're to use common sense and regard all that the Bible has to say on that or any subject. That's so important. Find the central truth. Number two, what's the context and background? Sometimes there's several lessons. You won't find very much of Jesus explaining or interpreting the parables. Some it's just very obvious. Some it may be more concealed than others. So note Jesus' interpretation, if he gives one, accept it as definitive and exhaustive, and look at it in the light of the circumstances of the lesson. Now, the amount of comparison varies from parable to parable. Don't try to make every detail mean something in each parable. The parable of the sower, so-called, behold, the sower went forth to sow. The birds are important. The sun is important. But the parable of the prodigal son are the details of the fatted calf and that he was in the swine, feeding swine, and the ring that was put on his finger. Those have no special significance. I'm reminded of another little Sunday school story of the teacher asking her class after they'd studied the prodigal son, who was the most upset at the return of the prodigal? And she thought they would say the older brother. This one child said, the fatted calf. So just remember that as a perspective. Let's see, where was I? Well, I don't want to make a distinction that an allegory is different from a parable. In an allegory, most every detail is going to have a meaning. If you want an example of an allegory, Paul in Galatians chapter 4 talks about the allegory between Sarah and Hagar, and the child of promise and the child who was not the child of promise at all. And that's Galatians 4:24 through 31. In a parable, if there are some details, often the details are what we've just called drapery or color. Makes the story a little more interesting, perhaps. But we don't need to press anything into meaning something in a parable. In both ancient and modern times, some have treated parables as allegories, and they've tried to read too much into it. Let me just show you how far back this goes. Origen, in AD 300, had this to say about the Good Samaritan. And he was really treating the parable of the Good Samaritan as an allegory. He said, the Good Samaritan, the man beaten was Adam. Jerusalem was heaven. Jericho was the world. The robbers were the devil and his comrades. The priest was the law. The Levite was the prophets. The Good Samaritan was Christ. The beast was Christ's body. The inn was the church. And the 2 pence was the Father and the Son. And the Good Samaritan's coming back. Jesus is going to come back. That's missed the whole point. That's pushed things and forced meanings that simply aren't there. The Good Samaritan is just a parable. And it was pointing out the priests and the Levites, the religious people of the day, were being prejudicial relative to who they showed benevolence to. And Jesus concealed that initially from them. The fact is, Jesus was not crucified for saying popular proverbs. He was crucified for saying something that was distinctive and exclusive to say. And Jesus said, the difference makes a difference. You know, people often will accept you and say, well, I don't mind that you have a different view. But it's when you say that the difference makes a difference, that's a different matter. It makes a difference whether we are obedient to the Lord. And the people have to make up their minds concerning Jesus both then and now. Well, I'm excited. We're going to have a good journey before us, and we will basically do one parable at a time, but when we do the prodigal son, we'll probably do lost sheep, lost coin, lost boy. It's a trilogy of parables, but they're all propounding a lesson for us. And I look forward to doing that as well as the other parables. Well, I'm a bit early, but you may need a little extra time in the rain, if it's still raining. And hopefully that temperature is 34, 35. Okay? Thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate each of you being here.